30 seconds. That's all it takes for God to place a miracle in our path. A trembling puppy in the snow, a weary man guided by something greater than instinct, and a moment where compassion becomes His quiet command. Some say miracles are rare, but those who listen know God whispers them into our lives when we need them most. If stories like this remind you of His grace, stay with us. And before we begin, please subscribe to Whisper Beings, like this video, and share it so His light can reach more hearts. The old highway cut through the small, forgotten town like a thin scar, quiet and pale beneath the winter sky. And the man driving through it seemed to blend into that stillness. An aging former rescue officer in a weather-faded orange jacket, jeans worn soft with time, and leather boots that had walked more miles of sorrow and service than he could count. He wasn't traveling anywhere special, just passing through, like he often did now, drifting from town to town with the slow patience of someone who had seen too much, but still couldn't quite stop caring. The wind outside pushed snow across the empty street in gentle waves, and for a moment he let himself breathe in the barren beauty of it all. Yet the mountains had taught him long ago that silence often hides the softest cries, and on that afternoon, a flicker in the corner of his eye pulled him out of his thoughts. Something small, something trembling, something chained. He hit the brakes with an instinct older than grief itself. Stepping out into the biting wind, he squinted toward a crooked wooden post behind a sagging fence. There, almost swallowed by drifting snow, was a tiny dog, no more than a fragile shadow. Its fur was patchy, stiff with cold, and its thin body shivered so violently the chain rattled against the post like a muffled plea. The man felt something inside him twist, the way a parent's heart clenches when hearing a child cry in the dark. He approached slowly, careful not to startle the little creature, though the dog didn't move away. It simply stared, exhausted, as if the world had taught it that hope was nothing but a passing visitor. "Easy there, little one," he murmured, his voice low, warm, carrying the kind of gentleness that had soothed many wounded beings, human and animal alike. The dog blinked. Snow clung to its eyelashes. The man knelt, holding his breath as he looked into those eyes full of hunger, fear, and a quiet longing that felt older than the winter around them. Just then, the door of the nearest house creaked open. A man stepped out, boots crunching in the snow, irritation written across his face as if compassion were a foreign inconvenience. "You trespassing for something?" he asked. The former rescue officer rose to his feet slowly, brushing frost from his knees. He gestured toward the shivering animal. "Why is he out here in the cold like this?" The answer was as sharp and careless as a thrown stone. "He's used to it." Used to it. The phrase hit harder than the wind, harder than the cold, as if suffering could ever become normal, as if a beating heart could ever truly grow accustomed to neglect. The officer swallowed his anger, though it bubbled up like a forgotten fire. He had seen situations like this too many times, seen the quiet cruelty of indifference, the invisible wounds carved by apathy. But anger wouldn't help the dog. Compassion would. And he had long ago vowed to choose compassion, even when others didn't deserve it. "He won't make it through the night," the man said softly. "I need to take him." The owner shrugged with a strange, almost relieved detachment. "Take him, then. Leave the chain." For a moment, the former officer stood very still. The words didn't make sense. Not in a world where life held value, where loyalty meant something, where warmth was something you offered, not withheld. Leave the chain. as if the cold metal wrapped around the dog's neck mattered more than the trembling creature itself, as if the chain were the treasure and the dog merely the inconvenience tied to it. The former officer exhaled slowly, grief settling in the lines of his face like old winter shadows. He bent down and gently unhooked the chain, ignoring the muttered protest behind him. With both arms, he lifted the fragile body to his chest. The dog was feather-light, the way only starvation could make a creature light, but its heart fluttered against him with the frantic rhythm of something desperate to keep going. "You're all right now," he whispered, cupping the dog close, letting its cold muzzle press against the wool lining of his jacket. "I've got you." The dog didn't respond, not with a bark, not with a whine, but its trembling eased by a fraction, and that was enough. He turned back toward his truck, boots sinking softly into the snow, letting the wind carry away the last echoes of the owner's indifference. Inside the cab, he placed the little dog onto a blanket he kept for emergencies, the same blanket that had warmed lost hikers and frostbitten wanderers years ago. As he shut the door and started the engine, he took one last look in the rearview mirror at the lonely house, the lonely fence, the lonely patch of earth where a life had been forgotten. The road stretched out ahead of him once more, but this time it felt less like a quiet passage and more like a promise whispered by a creature too weak to speak it. "Don't leave me behind." And he didn't. He drove on through the falling snow, heart heavier but somehow warmer, carrying with him a fragile life that still believed, against all odds, that kindness could exist in the world. The road out of the tiny town wound like a tired ribbon through the snow-soaked valley, and the former rescue officer drove slowly, not wanting to jostle the small shivering life curled beneath his jacket. The dog, little more than a bundle of bones wrapped in patchy fur, had fallen asleep moments after the engine's warmth reached him, his breath shallow but steady, his trust fragile but present. The man kept glancing down at him, as if afraid the tiny heartbeat might flicker out like a candle in the draft. He whispered now and then, not to comfort the dog alone, but to calm the ache that had stirred in his own chest. "You're safe, little one. I promise." Beyond the windshield, the world blurred into pale shades of white and blue, the kind of winter landscape that once brought him peace when he was younger, stronger, when his days were filled with search and rescue missions instead of wandering roads alone. He had walked into storms to find people who had given up hope. He had carried strangers out of ravines with frostbitten hands. He had knelt beside families and told them their loved one had been found. Some lived, some didn't. The ones who didn't were the ghosts that followed him now. Snow drifted heavier as he reached the outskirts of another cluster of old cabins, half inhabited, half forgotten. A thin trail of smoke curled lazily from a chimney, but most of the structures stood silent, the kind of silence that pressed into the ribs. If the little dog hadn't whimpered softly in his coat, he might have kept driving. But that tiny sound, thin, uncertain, was enough to sharpen his senses again, the way an old soldier snaps awake at the faintest rustle. He slowed the truck, scanning the snowy yard of a weather-worn cabin to his right. Something wasn't right. You learn to recognize neglect after years of working in the field. It has a look, a smell, a pulse of its own. He stepped out into the cold once more, careful not to wake the sleeping puppy tucked against his chest. The air felt heavier here, as if holding its breath. Behind the cabin sat a small wooden doghouse, barely larger than a child's toy chest, its roof bowed from years of snow. A weak scratching noise drifted from it, a lonely, rhythmic rasp. He approached with a steadiness born from experience, though a part of him already braced for sorrow. When he opened the little door, the scene inside tightened his throat. A dog, larger than the first but equally neglected, lay curled inside, spine jutting like the ridges of an abandoned mountain. Its ribs were sharp, each one a silent testimony of days without food, nights without warmth. Its breath fogged the air in faint, flickering bursts. And its eyes, dear God, its eyes locked onto his with the stunned disbelief of a soul who had forgotten kindness existed. "Hey," he whispered, lowering himself to the cold ground, letting his voice soften into something that might feel safe. "You don't have to hide anymore." The dog didn't move at first. Then, as if gathering the last drop of courage from a buried memory, it stretched its trembling neck forward and pressed its nose into the man's palm. The gesture was so gentle, so heartbreakingly polite, that the former officer had to close his eyes to steady himself. He wanted to wrap the dog in his arms. He wanted to lift it out of the shadows it had been left in for God knows how long. But he had to be careful. He had to be slow. Behind him, a sound of hurried claws startled him. A third dog, smaller, frantic, starved in its own way, darted out of another makeshift shelter. It ran straight toward him, tail tucked, body sunken, eyes wild with loneliness. Before he could react, it crashed into his side, burying its face against his jacket, as if begging not to be left behind. It shook violently, not from cold alone, but from fear of being abandoned again. "It's okay. You're okay now," he murmured, instinctively curling his free arm around the desperate creature. The puppy in his jacket stirred, but did not protest. Perhaps it, too, understood something about fear and being forgotten. For a moment, the man knelt in the snow, with one dog leaning into his ribcage and another pressing its frail head into his hand. 3 lives, 3 stories of neglect, converging in one quiet moment of mercy. He felt the weight of it, not as a burden, but as a calling he had never fully escaped. He reached for his phone with stiff fingers and called the nearest rescue unit. "I've got 3, maybe more. You'll need to send help." His voice cracked slightly, not from fear, but from a trembling mix of sadness and relief. Relief that he had found them in time. Sadness that he hadn't found them sooner. As he waited, he whispered to the dogs the way you whisper to children waking from nightmares. He told them they were brave. He told them they were loved. He told them that no chain, no hunger, no cold wind would ever define them again. Snow continued to fall around them like quiet blessings, settling onto fur, jacket, boots, and frozen earth. The former officer sat there among the forgotten cabins, cradling trembling bodies against his warmth, until the wail of the rescue van broke the stillness. Help had arrived. And slowly, hesitantly, the valley began to breathe again. The veterinary clinic sat at the edge of the valley like a lantern glowing against the winter dusk, its windows fogged with warm breath and healing hopes. When the former rescue officer pushed open the door, cradling the fragile German Shepherd puppy inside his jacket, the familiar scent of antiseptic and fleece blankets washed over him, an aroma woven into old memories of emergencies, rescues, and quiet victories. The staff didn't ask many questions. They knew the look in his eyes, that mix of sorrow and determination that only someone who had carried too many wounded beings could wear. They took the puppy from his arms with a tenderness that felt almost sacred. As the vets examined the little body, touching each rib, checking for frostbite, warming cold paws between gentle palms, the former officer sat in the waiting room with a heaviness resting in his bones. He watched snow gather on the boots of the rescue team who arrived moments later with the other dogs. They carried them in carefully, bundled in blankets like fragile relics rescued from the ruins of a forgotten world. Each dog had a different story carved into its fur, its eyes, its trembling breath. Stories of empty bowls, long nights, and the bitter loneliness that clings to abandoned creatures like a second skin. One of the volunteers, a woman with soft silver hair and the calm presence of someone who has seen the worst of life, yet still chooses kindness, placed a hand on his shoulder. "They're safe now," she whispered. "Thanks to you." He didn't speak. He simply nodded, because gratitude hurt in moments like this. After years of rescuing humans, it was the animals, these voiceless, trusting souls, that had a way of breaking him open the deepest. Hours passed quietly, unfolding in slow, gentle layers. The clinic's heater hummed like an old song warming cold memories. A kettle whistled softly in the back room. Somewhere, a dog barked, weak but alive. The vet appeared at last, wiping her hands on her scrubs. "They'll all make it," she said, offering a small smile. "Malnourished, neglected, terrified, but alive. And that's a start." Relief loosened something inside him that had been knotted all afternoon. But it was the next thing she said that stopped him completely. "That first puppy," she added, glancing toward the recovery room, "hasn't taken his eyes off the door since we carried him away from you. He watches every shadow, every movement, waiting for you." The former officer felt his breath catch. He wasn't sure why it surprised him. Loyalty often took root fastest in the souls most desperate for love. Still, the idea of that tiny creature searching for him stirred something warm beneath the old layers of grief he carried. When he entered the recovery room, the puppy lifted his head instantly. Those fragile ears perked, and a faint, raspy whine slipped from his throat. Soft, hopeful, trembling with recognition. The man knelt beside, feeling the cold tile against his knees. "Hey there, little one," he whispered, stroking the puppy's cheek with the back of his knuckles. The dog leaned into the touch so eagerly it nearly broke his heart. He could feel the tiny heartbeat pressing against his palm, a timid rhythm learning to trust again. Nearby, the other rescued dogs rested on warm blankets, bandaged, fed, slowly surrendering to the safety of this new world. One lifted its head as he spoke. Another scooted closer, as if hope were contagious and they wanted to feel a bit of its warmth too. The man stayed there a long time, long enough for the puppy to finally relax, long enough for fear to loosen its grip on the room. He spoke in low, comforting tones, telling them stories of mountain trails and rivers thawing in spring, of lost hikers reunited with families, of a world beyond the walls they had been trapped behind. Something in his voice soothed even the exhausted volunteers. The puppy eventually drifted to sleep, chin resting on his forearm, breathing warm against his skin. He didn't move. He just sat with him, letting the tiny life trust him completely. When the vet checked in again, she paused at the doorway, watching the quiet scene. "He's chosen you," she said softly. The man looked up, startled by the certainty in her tone. "Animals like him," she continued. "They know things. They know who saved them. They know who will protect them." She offered a gentle smile. "He's not letting you go." Not now." The former officer looked down at the sleeping puppy, his small body curled against his chest like a fragile vow. He hadn't planned on taking any of the dogs home. Rescuing them was one thing. Rebuilding his own life with them was another. But as he gently gathered the puppy into his arms again, wrapping him in a soft blanket, he realized something unexpected had shifted in him, too. Maybe souls didn't find each other by accident. Maybe some rescues went both ways. When he stepped out into the night, the wind no longer felt as cold. Snowflakes landed softly on the puppy's head, and the little creature nestled deeper into his coat, trusting him with the full weight of its tiny, healing heart. And for the first time in a long while, the man felt as if he was carrying more than a life. He was carrying a second chance, one meant for them both. The cabin waited for them like an old friend, its porch light glowing faintly through the snowy dusk, its wooden steps creaking in welcome as the former rescue officer carried the small German Shepherd puppy inside. The warmth rushed to greet them the moment the door closed, and the fire in the stone hearth crackled softly as if it, too, sensed a new story beginning beneath its orange glow. He gently set the puppy down on a folded quilt near the fire, watching as the little creature lifted his head, sniffed the air, and blinked against the golden light. For the first time since he had found him, the puppy wasn't shaking. He was simply curious. And curiosity, the man knew, was often the first sign that a broken soul had begun to heal. "Take your time," he whispered, removing his jacket and setting it beside the pup, just in case the familiar scent helped. He prepared a small bowl of warm broth the way he had done years ago for injured search dogs in mountain outposts. Slowly, patiently, with just enough warmth to soothe a frightened belly. When he set the bowl beside the puppy, tiny paws lifted hesitantly, and the dog took a few trembling laps, as if rediscovering the very idea of comfort. The man lowered himself onto the floor, his joints protesting softly, and sat beside him. For a long while, they shared the kind of silence that didn't need filling. The fire popped gently. Snow slid off the roof in a muffled sigh. Somewhere outside, the wind combed through the pines like an old hymn. But inside, there was peace. A quiet, fragile peace that neither of them had felt in far too long. Over the next days, the cabin became a sanctuary of small miracles. The puppy followed him everywhere, across the creaking floorboards, out to the porch, through the yard where the snow lay sparkling like crushed stardust. When the man chopped firewood, the puppy sat nearby, tilting his head as if studying the rhythm of the axe. When he made morning coffee, the puppy's tail thumped against the cabinets. When night fell and the man settled into bed beneath his heavy wool blanket, the little creature climbed onto the edge of the mattress and curled into a ball, as if the darkness could not harm him as long as warmth rested within reach. The man couldn't deny how deeply this new companionship reached into his aging heart. He spoke to the puppy the way people speak to those they trust, softly, honestly, without pretenses. He told him stories of search and rescue missions in the mountains, of the hikers he'd carried out of ravines, of the dog partners who had once run at his side. He even spoke of the losses, those cold nights when he had not arrived in time, when the world had taken more than he could save. The puppy listened with a stillness that only animals possess, blinking slowly, leaning his small weight against him, as if offering comfort in return. As the days stretched into weeks, the man began training the pup the way he had once trained seasoned rescue dogs. But this time, everything felt gentler, more deliberate. He started with simple tasks, teaching the puppy to stay still at his whistle, to follow his hand signals, to search for hidden objects tucked beneath blankets or behind porch posts. The pup learned quickly, driven by a desire not to impress, but to connect, to understand the man who had lifted him from freezing soil and shown him the shape of kindness. Day by day, courage bloomed where fear had lived. The puppy grew stronger. His once patchy fur thickened, and a shy spark lit his eyes whenever the man praised him. He even discovered joy, that forgotten treasure. He chased snowflakes that landed on the porch railing. He carried pine cones in his mouth as if they were trophies. He rolled on his back near the fire, paws curled in playful surrender. One evening, while the sun bled into the horizon in soft shades of amber, the man watched the pup practice climbing the small mound of snow near the shed. The tiny dog would scramble up, slip down, scramble again, determined, hopeful, fearless in ways that echoed the man's younger years. A warmth spread in the man's chest, not from the fire, but from the quiet realization that he was no longer just saving a life. He was witnessing a rebirth. And something in him was being reborn, too. Later that night, as the fire softened into glowing embers, the pup lifted his head from the man's lap and gazed up with an expression that seemed almost human in its tenderness. The man stroked his ear gently, feeling the silky fur beneath his fingertips. "You're going to do great things," he whispered. But the truth, unspoken yet clear, was this. The puppy had already done something great. He had brought warmth back into a life that had grown cold with time. Hope curled beside him now, breathing softly, dreaming gently. And in the quiet heart of that winter cabin, two souls, both once forgotten by the world, began learning how to be whole again. Years slipped by the way snow melts down a mountainside, slow at first, then all at once, carried quietly by time's gentle insistence. Seasons changed around the cabin, yet inside its wooden walls, companionship grew like a steady flame that refused to fade. The once fragile German Shepherd puppy blossomed into a strong, broad-shouldered dog with a soft heart and loyal eyes that never left the man who had saved him. They became an inseparable pair, bound not by obedience, but by a devotion so natural, it felt as though it had been written for them long before their paths crossed. The man trained him with the patience of someone who knows the value of second chances, and the dog rose to every challenge with a sweetness that made the volunteers of the rescue unit smile in quiet amazement. Before long, he was accompanying the man on real search and rescue calls, first in simple tasks like carrying supplies or alerting volunteers, and later in more serious missions, where his keen senses and steadfast courage saved lives stranded in storms or hidden beneath fallen branches. But the most remarkable thing about him was not his growing skill. It was the gentleness in him, how he approached frightened children with a bowed head, how he nuzzled wounded hikers with a tenderness that felt almost like gratitude, how he returned after each rescue and rested his head on the man's knee as if saying, "We did it together." The rescue unit gave him a name that felt like a blessing whispered into the wind, Haven. For he had become a harbor of hope for all who crossed his path. And the name suited him perfectly, for he carried something bright within him, something that reminded the man every day that love, when given freely, has the power to transform even the most broken beginnings into something beautifully whole. The years carved their quiet marks upon them both. The man's hair turned silver, his steps slowed, and the winter cold bit deeper into his joints. But Haven stayed at his side with the steadfastness of a guardian who had made a promise long ago. On days when the man felt the weight of age pressing harder than usual, Haven pressed his warm body against his leg, guiding him gently down the cabin steps or lying beside him as he rested. On nights when memories returned uninvited, faces he couldn't save, storms he barely survived. Haven sensed the shift and climbed onto the bed, resting his head on the man's chest until the trembling passed. One autumn morning, when the mountains wore their cloak of gold and the air tasted faintly of goodbye, the rescue unit held a ceremony to honor Haven for years of service. Volunteers gathered, some wiping tears before they could fall, as the man placed a medal around the dog's neck. Haven sat proudly, though his tail wagged with humble softness, as if unsure why everyone was looking at him with such affection. The man knelt beside him, his voice thick with emotion as he whispered, "You were the one who made me whole again." And there was truth in those words, quiet, undeniable truth, because in saving Haven, the man had found his own healing. Winter returned, the kind of winter that settles deep into the bones of the earth, and the man grew slower still. Haven stayed near every hour, resting his muzzle on the man's knee, following him from room to room, curling at his feet like a loyal heartbeat. One night, as snow drifted against the cabin windows, the man reclined in his old armchair, wrapped in a thick blanket he had used on countless rescue missions. Haven climbed beside him, laying his head gently against the man's chest, the same place he had rested as a trembling puppy so many years before. The man stroked his fur, fingertips brushing through the warm, familiar coat. His voice was soft, as though speaking into a sacred quiet. "You've stayed with me through everything, Haven." The dog lifted his eyes, those same earnest, shimmering eyes the man had first seen chained in the cold, and nudged the man's chin with a tenderness that held a lifetime of gratitude. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines. Inside, the fire dimmed into a warm sigh. The man exhaled slowly, peacefully, his hand still resting on Haven's back. And Haven remained where he always had, loyal, steady, watching over the man with the devotion of a soul who had been given a chance at life and chose to repay it with love. When dawn touched the mountains with pale gold, the man's breathing had stilled. But Haven did not move from his side. He kept his vigil through the morning, the way a guardian keeps promises that last beyond this world. In time, neighbors came, the rescue volunteers came, and they found the two of them together, as they had always been, one hand resting gently on the dog who had been saved, the dog who had saved him in return. And so the story of the forgotten puppy who once shivered beside a cold chain ended not in sorrow, but in love. A love that carried him through the years, a love that stayed until the final breath, a love that proved, quietly and beautifully, that sometimes the souls we rescue become the very souls who rescue us. In every quiet corner of this world, God sends his miracles not with thunder, but with gentle signs. A rescued puppy, a warm hand, a heart choosing compassion when it would be easier to look away. If this story reminded you that his light still guides us, that he watches over even the smallest of his creatures, then hold that faith close. Let it comfort you, lift you, and remind you that we are never truly alone. If this touched your heart, please subscribe to Whisper Beings, like, share, and leave a comment. Help spread God's quiet miracles to more souls.